Hi there, happy Wednesday. We are coming live from the Pyramid Atlantic building where our offices are at the Neighborhood Design Center in Hyattsville, Maryland. And I'm so pleased to be here today with Kelly Fleming, our in-house landscape architect, and she's our director of landscape design and environmental resilience. And with Jason Sprouls, our program manager for forestry and a certified arborist. And our conversation today is going to be around tree equity. It's something we think about a lot, talk about a lot, and do a lot of work with here at the Neighborhood Design Center throughout Prince George's County and also as well in Baltimore. We have a long history of doing so, lots of thoughts and meaty conversations to get into. Thank you for joining us today. Really want to encourage that this is a dialogue conversation. Audience members are encouraged to, please be a part of the conversation in the comments. I'll be here taking a look at the comments and certainly bring your questions forward so that we can hear from our team here about their thoughts and responses. So tree equity, should we dive in? Yes. What's tree equity? What is it? Why does it matter? Kind of what's the big picture here?
Yeah. Tree equity really outlines the framework and understanding surrounding the disproportionate access to urban and community vegetation such as trees, woody plants, shrubs across socioeconomic and racial lines. A lot of quantitative studies have shown that access to healthy tree canopy cover is significantly lower in neighborhoods that have been historically Black or brown and have achieved lower levels of income. And in the past few years, especially, a lot of empirical data has been released to quantify the disproportionate levels of urban forestry canopy cover and targeting planting initiatives in those neighborhoods to address that inequity.
Because we also know how the benefits of tree planting, especially in terms of climate change and keeping the heat island down. I mean, really lowering energy costs. And so there are many health and economic benefits that come along with a robust tree canopy. And there is also a misperception in these lower income communities that they don't appreciate or want trees, and that's often not the case. And so we need to meet communities where they are and find these underserved communities and really give back and try to promote tree planting in these places that have very low canopy coverages.
I feel like I've seen a lot of recent studies in the last few years that look at sort of different elements of this, like asthma rates and trees in urban areas. It seems like it's a issue across the country. How does it manifest particularly in our footprint here? I mean, where are we seeing sort of particular trends or things that we can learn from this sort of the bigger studies that we can then apply in locally on how to sort of start to address
I would say, that we're a lot of environmental justice mapping tools are available now. I can't remember the exact links right now, but there's a lot of census data. We can look through GIS where the canopy coverage is, and where it's not, and often we can see these overlapping patterns for our own selves, and then start to dive deeper into those areas and why. And it's true, the underserved areas are not just underserved, but often the dumping grounds, for power plants or treatment plants or just industrial uses, and there are not as many green areas connecting these spaces because they had not considered these neighborhoods as worthy of better treatment.
Yeah.
in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Oh, I think a word that you said that really stood out to me is underinvestment. I feel like there's been a lot of procedural and policy really that have been inequitable across racial lines, things like redlining. And if you track those policy frameworks, you will see a clear relationship between the amount of trees and the people that live there. And for a long time, there's been no real interest by a lot of people, both explicitly and implicitly, to bridge the gap between racial and economic lines and tree plantings. Mm-hmm. And I think tools like Kelly was talking about have really helped us measure and quantify where those gaps exist. An exciting tool that was published about 2 years ago through the Arbor Day Foundation and the American Forests was the American Forest Tree Equity Tool, which allows you to go with the census block to determine where and how equitable tree canopy cover is using a bunch of different factors. I know the state of Maryland and DNR has one as well. But for a long time, it was really reliant on people making ad hoc observations, and now we're starting to really get a lot of robust data to support kind of science-based decisions on where those trees ought to be planted to address this.
And I believe this is our strong point. This is where our organization really gets on the ground, because we're the ones talking to these communities, and as you say, like we find these communities. And we will often find like a lot of distrust of people coming in and saying, you need these trees, you know? So we really need to change our approach. You know, they're used to government agencies hiring contractors to just go in and put as many trees wherever they need to go, and then not following up on them and not checking the maintenance. And I mean, they may have had a damaged tree planted in front of their yard and no one else even came to check on it, and it just became a hassle and a problem they had to deal with versus a benefit. And so really following up, communicating beforehand, establishing relationships, establishing a place where people can come and ask questions later. You know, how do I maintain these trees? I mean, these are all the things that we try to bring into our process of meeting these communities and trying to advocate for more trees. Mm-hmm. Don't get me wrong, a large majority of the time when we do come into these communities, they want the trees, but we do face, you know, often distrust based on years of being underserved or not heard.
Yeah. And so what does that look like when you're out there kind of like walking the streets and you're that guy with the clipboard, you know, if a resident wants to engage in a conversation, wants to let you know, actually I'm not a fan of trees, I don't want one in my yard, like how would you approach that, or what's the ethos that you bring for those conversations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And for those in the audience who might not know, one of the flagship programs that NDC is able to coordinate is Prince George's County's roadside tree program called the Right Tree, Right Place program. For 12 years, we've been the engagement, design, and outreach consultant driving the bus on a robust street tree planting program. And we coordinate and identify with community groups to find where the hazardous trees and problematic trees are, to either prune them or remove them and plant new trees where there's space to support new trees. So I found that in my experience, Prince George's County is a really interesting case study nationwide. A lot of cities across the country have measured their inequity, and it's prevalent in any major metropolitan city in the country. But what stands out as unique with Prince George's County specifically is the Bradford pear tree was developed in Prince George's County. And for those who might not know what that tree is, it's a large shade tree that develops really beautiful white flowers in the spring. It was a cultivated variety of pear that was developed here in Prince George's County. So it was our county street tree for the better part of 40 or 50 years. But as they grow older, they develop really brittle wood that's really susceptible to breaking apart, to the point where a otherwise healthy tree will lose a large caliber branch that could destroy someone's car or worse, threaten someone's life. So Yes, they were readily available and planted in mass across the entire county, and consequently, a lot of our neighborhoods that are underserved, if they've even had access to street trees, it's confounded by the fact that the street trees they had were likely those Bradford pears that have been so problematic with no rhyme or reason. So people are especially distrustful of our street trees. And I found kind of like in one of my earliest days working with NDC over 2.5 years ago, I inspected a street that was rather devoid of street trees, and I was excited to plant it and was gearing up to bring an awesome street tree design. And I found a lot of resistance from the community members, and it really surprised me. My identity as a white male from a upper middle class neighborhood, my experiences with trees were really positive. My parents had a beautiful front tree in the front yard that was well taken care of, and that's the experience of a lot of other people who maybe share a similar background to me. But I found that a lot of people in this neighborhood, which was a low-income, predominantly Black and brown neighborhood, were incredibly resistant to the idea of new trees. They've had a lot of those pear trees, and they were distrustful of county governance. Their sidewalks have been left to crumble and crack. Their roads don't get repaired. So it's a product of a larger system of distrust from county governance, but I think repairing that distrust kind of in the ways that Kelly was talking about is really important. It's not necessarily how, it's really more important how you do it rather than what you do. It's more important to engage and change people's minds before going and planting 10, 100, 1,000 trees.
Or in some cases have your mind changed, essentially, right? To say, in this case, it's better to not have the tree. We hear from that resident and move on in the course of the program, but realize that their agency in their place is a big factor.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that kind of fits right in with our organization's mission, which is that our community partners are the experts. And I think an understandable mistake a lot of practitioners tend to make is that they view trees as a very scientific deliverance of provisionary services that improve our health and environment. But when you neglect to acknowledge the lived experience of the people who are going to inherit these trees, it's really damaging. For example, who am I to come into somebody's neighborhood and suggest that a tree would make it a better place? Because their neighborhood is a great place. It's leading with empathy, understanding, and slowing down the process and showing people like, this can be good. What do you want out of your tree? If you want it, not forcing it upon someone. And a way I kind of carry that into the field work we conduct is if somebody does say, I'm hesitant to accept a tree in front of my property, or I'm not sure I want a tree in the county space in front of my property, I tell them, this is a free tree. This is completely optional. You're part of the process right now by declining this tree, and I invite this conversation. What goals could you have for trees or plants in front of your property if you see that being an opportunity? And if not, I want to respect your opinion because your word is final.
We also, bridging hearts and minds, bringing everyone together, and then the neighborhood will bring their neighbors up too. And we found that, and working and also it's difficult working in these very small right-of-ways, lots of power lines, and so it's difficult to find suitable places to plant trees, and that's been a problem in the past because trees may have been planted that were inappropriate for the spaces, that caused different kinds of problems that the residents may not have known how to deal with them, and so we feel that the educational component is really huge, and letting neighbors, the communities understand that tree selection is really important.
A tree isn't a tree.
Exactly.
There's
yes, and so when I watch the news, the weather storm reports about trees coming down, like I know, I know that that all of these horror stories are almost completely because of one tree. Now we have seen more intense storms, and we've been seeing more damage. So I'm not going to say that Bradford pears are the only trees that have that kind of damage. But, understanding, long-term maintenance practices, keeping an eye on that tree for dead branches, making sure that there is an adequate root area spread, like a plant, because oftentimes these median strips are so tiny, the tree gets really big, and it doesn't have that root stability to keep it in place because it's been all tight in that restricted space. So there's a lot of things that we're learning about trees that cause problems, and by educating the community about, reasons why certain problems were, it's not, trying to, like, it's not all trees. It's about knowing what right tree, knowing the best way to take care of it, knowing what to look for, potential damage, and, having something done about it before it gets to the point where you're faced with the real possibility of branches or trees coming over.
You touched on sort of that as we get bigger storms and as we're kind of moving into the future, and I know you think a lot about climate change and community resilience in the face of climate change. How is, as we're really driving towards a more equitable distribution of the resources when it comes to tree canopy for all of the economic and health reasons, as we look to the future, kind of what's on the line? Like what, how are trees a component to this, like mitigating climate change and also mitigating very hyper-local, negative future states that we can see coming?
Well, these deep, these very dense, rather, urban areas are also subject to the worst of the heat changes. That there's more deaths associated in the lower income areas when we have these huge heat waves, and we know that trees lower temperature. I mean, I live in a neighborhood, or I grew up in a neighborhood, an old neighborhood, one of the probably first, not old, but first suburban kind of turnovers from old parkland shade. But it was a beautiful place to grow up. But what I realized over the years growing up and being a landscape architect and observing trees in other neighborhoods and things, realized that the developers put in the cheapest tree that they could throughout the neighborhood, which happened to be a silver maple. And over the years now, where that development should have a huge, wonderful tree canopy that would basically be the real estate value of these older homes right now, right? We don't have that because of this particular tree fruit system that it pushed up so many sidewalks and caused so many problems with residents that most of them are cut down. And so they've been replaced, but they're, that's 40 years, 40, 50, however many years of tree growth that they lost because the wrong species was planted. And then, and I remember very, very well walking my dogs in the heat of the summer, having to go out like early because it would, so we wouldn't
go out after 8 o'clock.
And there was one house, there's one house in the corner a few blocks away that had planted an oak. An oak tree in this small, narrow space, and it had grown straight up. And there were no roots pushing up because we know that those oaks had those deep tap roots. The canopy spread halfway across the tree, across the street rather. And I would love, like, there's the tree. We could go and just stand there for a few minutes and literally feel the temperature drop right there. And just imagine if that whole street was like that. I wouldn't have to, worry about what time, how early I had to get out in the morning before the sun rose to walk the dogs because, it would be a comfortable, pleasant experience. And so that's what we, and when you get into the more affluent neighborhoods, they're used to that. They understand what a comforting experience it is walking under these canopies of trees who've had more space and time to grow big and lush, and so there are a lot of ways that we need to address the current situations that we have in our cities so that they can benefit from, on the hottest days of the summer, just having a tree to go to sit under, or a tree shading your house where you can just open the window and the breeze comes through. But without that, it's just unbearably hot.
And I love talking to experts. I love picking your brains. I love walking around in parks and streets with you all because you can point those things out that I'm not trained as an arborist. I don't know. Oh, I like trees, but I don't know enough to know why the oak tree particularly. And so to just hear you describe that, I think many people can relate to the experience of knowing, oh, that was a beautiful spot when I got to the cool part of the sidewalk. But to hear that we don't have to just, the experience of having so many bad trees, like you've described, that they were inappropriately selected. And so to bring in this level of understanding of expertise of not just the science of this particular tree, but then the relationship of how community members are going to live around it and experience it, and taking that all into consideration as we're thinking about how to increase canopy in a way that's relevant, in a way that's not, taking away agency in the decision-making process. So I think there's a lot of interwoven elements that are really interesting.
Well, especially I see urban forestry and the planting of trees is truly intersectional between human health and environmental crises. These are a way to address both of those issues at once. I can't name many other technologies that do that so simply. And another way that we're preparing for climate change is it's continuing to get worse and worse as the years go on. At the Right Tree, Right Place program, the Prince George's County Street Tree program that I help operationalize, is really encouraging a more wide palette of tree species being planted in each neighborhood we partner with. Kind of like Kelly was saying, historically, landscape developers or even urban foresters in the past would often select to plant the cheapest, most readily available tree stock and rely on kind of a monoculture, which is one type of tree creating one urban forest, which isn't really resilient if, say, a pest or disease is to be introduced. About 10 years ago, an invasive beetle from Asia called the emerald ash borer beetle came through the United States, and it has wiped out all of our ash trees that are native to the region. So some of our communities lost all of its street tree cover in a matter of a few years. So one way we're preparing for that is by planting at a block by block or neighborhood-wide scale a more diverse palette of tree species that are underplanted or underutilized, that can deliver a lot of different types of environmental and human services. And we also do that at the county level too. There's a principle I follow, which is Dr. Frank Santanamore's tree diversity principle, which is, you don't want to exceed 30% of one genus of species, 20% of one family, or 10% of one species. So meeting those guidelines as well. And then also you can do certain types of analysis to determine cities that have our climate for the projected 50 years, planting trees now that are native to that region, so that as our climate continues to get hotter, our trees aren't continuing to suffer from diminished growth rate and longevity because of the genome. So planting more southern species is the way we're kind of getting at.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. Kind of looking ahead and how can we start to anticipate and prepare instead of always kind of just reacting. And something else that we've been talking about, we haven't really formalized anything yet, but how can we incorporate citizen science and
you were talking about that earlier. Yeah, tell us more.
And we haven't. But basically, technology has come so far. They're automatic temperature sensors, rain gauges, lots of. You can just physically look, or you can have them uploaded to a computer database. There are a lot of tools that would be pretty easy to use, especially with smartphones these days, to have communities start doing that. Hey, take a temperature where there are no trees. Go and take a temperature where there are a lot of trees. Start to to feel it for themselves.
Yes, yeah.
And that's not us going in there and telling you you need to do this. This is for your own good. But explaining and teaching and communicating together and spreading the knowledge and awareness.
Yeah. And really that idea of like learning from a particular community, what they might have a sense of, well, it's really loud or it's really hot at that certain place, or that's a place that feels a certain way. Well, how can that information, that happens across, I think, a lot of our different sort of design projects where we're saying, actually, there was one I know you'd appreciate, a park that we worked on a few years ago when we put out a comment box to say, what should we know to the community? And we got a handwritten note that had all of the different birds that this resident had seen in that neighborhood over the years, and it was just beautiful. But we don't know all the things that someone's living right adjacent to a potential tree site or a park might know, and so that exchange I think is really wonderful to say, like, how can we, if we engage in some citizen science projects where we're trying to gather more data in the neighborhood, that can sort of highlight for us as well as like reinforce for communities some things they might already know and maybe not have the data for.
Right.
And then once you have the data and we share the data, and then communities can also use that to advocate in different ways, to ask for different resources, to track things over time.
Yeah, and I feel like kind of what I'm hearing from you is like, and I agree, it's like people have power, and how do we share that power and empower people to participate and influence the decisions we make? And I feel like there's a lot of movement towards planting more trees in underserved, underrepresented neighborhoods, and there's a right and wrong way to do it. I think going there and just planting as many large shade trees as you can is the wrong way to do it. Not engaging people is the wrong way to do it. The path to hell is paved with intentions, to be honest. I think being trustworthy and taking the time to slow the process down to collect more qualitative data is a really underrated way to administer a street tree or tree planting program. I think a lot about like what makes trust, especially when you yourself as a practitioner don't look like the people you want to serve, and it's ability, benevolence, and transparency. And I think a way that we can do that is by sharing our power, sharing our knowledge, and sharing our intentions with people so that they know where our hearts and minds are and where we can come together as one. And I think like an example of that is like sometimes I could walk a neighborhood and identify a big, large right-of-way median where it'd be awesome to plant some beautiful oak, elm, maple, large shade trees. But in conversations with our community partners, they're going to say sometimes, for example, I've had this happen, whoa, like our kids all gather there every summer, and that's where they're playing football and soccer. Like, don't plant trees there. And like that lived experience is such an underrated asset when coordinating street tree plantings, because without it, you might exclude people from the spaces they occupy and use every day, and those trees aren't something that's building capacity and community connection, rather taking away, and that's really harmful.
And once you can be in that really generative conversation with the community and say, oh, great, no, that's not a good spot for those trees at all, tell me more about where would work better, and then you're building that rapport and that relationship. I know your phone is always ringing with community members, and that approach to being really human and building relationships, I think, is a differentiator in our program, and that you clearly are developing those ways of being together, and that people are calling you 3-4 years later to say, Jason, my tree, I thought it was, it needs someone to look at it, and I know you're kind of responsive in those ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best part of my job is Prince George County is 500 square miles, over 300 different communities in the entire county, and we've worked with a large number of them. I've made a lot of awesome friends and heard some great stories. So if they're maybe listening, thanks for tuning in. But yeah, I feel like the most impactful thing I can do is using these trees as an agent of change in these neighborhoods that have been so disinvested and otherwise ignored by municipal and provisionary services. And there's definitely times where those interactions don't start off very positive. For example, if that change happened and the homeowner wasn't aware there'd be a street tree planted or their street tree would get cut down. We don't always reach everybody, but I feel like the number one thing you can do is lead with empathy and understanding. This is somebody's house. They've raised their kids there. They've seen their grandkids live there. And when you come and start changing things and people aren't aware, it's upsetting. Like, I would be annoyed. And, rather than getting defensive or trying to really justify my decisions, I try to really leave with a little bit of understanding, being like, I'm sorry, like, we didn't reach you. How can I make this better for you? What would you want? What are your goals? What are your priorities? Are trees a part of that? If they're not, it's okay. Just kind of things like that. I think those are really important.
I know we're running out of time, but I just wanted to mention really quickly that what else that we like to do is leverage our on the ground work with each community. So, for instance, we're working on a park with Seat Pleasant, the city of Seat Pleasant, and Jason has been to talk to the town about planting street trees in the municipality. But then we applied for a National Fish and Wildlife grant a few months back that we received, that we can do an entire inventory, including outreach. So, so the combination of all those things, being part of the community already from the work that we do, and then getting their support to go after more money for tree inventory, and now we can really incorporate that in a meaningful way, all those pieces. So it becomes not just street planting now, it's totally community capacity building.
And another one of those new exciting grants is developing out some maintenance training for municipalities as well, right?
Yes.
So then we're looking at the full life cycle and saying it's not just getting the trees in the ground, it's making sure that we have the, multifaceted sort of community support and buy-in and maintenance plans to make that a successful long-term endeavor. Build capacity, build knowledge, and all of the exciting things that I learned from you can be shared with, more broadly. So.
Yeah. And we're trying to build upon that every day, and hopefully over time build a more robust post-planting program that really has a resource and a hub for community members to have continued contact. Be able to answer questions.
That's exciting.
And if there's time for me to mention,
yeah,
for people who are like really interested in learning more about tree equity, I'd say like the most widely known paper that has kind of discussed and investigated this came out of Detroit, Michigan. It was about the resistance to street tree plantings, and it really took a deep dive in understanding the socio-political relationships between the constituency and the local government when trying to plant trees. And you guys are right on. It's like kind of what the findings suggested was like, it wasn't that people didn't like trees, it's they didn't like the relationship the county had with the people and their trees. Yeah. There was a heritage neglect between the county and their trees. People often felt like they weren't included on the process, but most importantly, the trees weren't being maintained throughout their lifetime. And I think maintenance is something that almost every single practitioner paper will tell you is the most underfunded and underappreciated part of the process, which is like, you planted this tree, but how are you going to follow through and ensure that it's not going to die? It's going to develop its structure, its roots are well taken care of. So the maintenance is a very underappreciated component of our work, and I think more people are starting to acknowledge that, it seems. But really, the follow-through is also important. Not just can we get these trees in the ground, but can we prove to these neighborhoods that have been so ignored, so neglected, that this program is going to take care of them and ensure that they develop great structure, with the right tree in the right place.
Well, I think we should, thank you both so much. It's been really helpful. We should, there's a couple of questions in the comments here. So, oh my goodness, more questions than I realized. Okay. Are any trees only planted in public land, or are some folks open to planting on their private land? So I guess it depends on the context here, like as we hone in on sort of in which jurisdictions. So that's a little hard to answer.
Let me just say, the Right Tree, Right Place program that the county operates in is currently working on right-of-ways.
Yeah.
But we encounter a number of community groups that are very heavily invested in their communities in helping to spread residential tree plantings.
Yeah.
And so we've worked with some of those through grants,
yeah.
Giving tree planting demonstrations. We had a tree planting demonstration at a neighbor who offered his yard. And was it Sea Pleasant? It might have been Sea Pleasant.
Mhm.
Yeah, after last fall,
Yeah.
and
So it sounds like a lot of our funding and a lot of the funding out there is for public lands, but that there's an interest, and it sounds like
Right.
community interest in doing more. In
yes,
residential
definitely.
spaces.
And so as we find those groups, then we help then go out actually and do this somewhat of the same work.
Mhm.
You know, is this tree appropriate for your yard?
Yeah.
Enough space for that, and so
Yeah.
because they're different. You know,
Yeah.
different trees. The same way for
Yeah.
street trees, same for
Yeah,
the same thing for residential.
Another question coming in: do you have any ideas for educating developers, architects, city planners, and other disciplines involved in projects that impact the land about native or other appropriate trees?
And I do believe that awareness is growing. The county itself, Prince George's County Landscape Manual, stresses native trees, and a lot of other jurisdictions, Washington D.C., they Montgomery County, natives are a big part of their landscaping guidelines. But I think with as far as developers and architects and planners who aren't on board yet, I think it needs to come from the communities.
Yeah.
And because in these particular arenas of practice, the landscape has been historically left to the very last kind of decorating, and not thought of as integral to the planning and construction. And so there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed within the construction and design industry. But I'm thinking project by project. Get some pushback on it. You know? Ask those
really
questions.
Hold those decision makers accountable to a broader set of expectations. Wow, a lot of questions. Curious to hear your thoughts on zoning and incorporating green spaces and street trees in the planning process for real estate developers. So that's pretty sort of like relevant to the prior question, but the sort of like
you don't want to.
Question.
These developers don't want to hear my answer.
Well, we want them to hear your answer.
I mean, I don't know what standards are out there right now per jurisdiction, but minimum tree box widths and lengths. Make sure that you've got enough soil volume for the trees that you plant. Really testing soils and understanding what you have and what and how it may need to be amended, because we've got so many urban compacted soils that if you just dig a hole and then expect these tree roots to grow out into this compacted mess beyond it, it's not going to happen. You're just going to have a dead tree in 5 years.
I can speak from experience and some vacant lot projects. You start digging, and what you're bringing up is not soil; it's bricks, it's crumble,
and
it's
so
walls. It's
that's
not
like one really what's going on under the ground is so important, and we don't pay attention to anything except for the ground up. So concentration on how the trees are planted, what they're given to start out with, and I would almost go a step further and start to have some type of ratio of unmowed native meadows versus lawns. That would reduce the energy costs of mowing, reduce watering, and then provide more access to water to be infiltrated into the groundwater, provide more habitat for birds, butterflies, grasshoppers, and so really just looking
way
really
more intentional with that landscape. Like
way
you said earlier,
more
it's not decoration.
It's not decoration. Yes.
And even I feel like a lot of times there's policy out there, but enforcement usually doesn't have much teeth to it. And for example, developers plant trees, but they're under a bond for 2 years, and then they're released to Prince George's County right away. But a lot of trees die within a 2 or 3 year window. So I think even expanding that window and keeping developers more accountable to planting a more diverse palette.
And there are mechanisms out there. I would say the sites rating system. I mean, if more municipalities would start adhering to that right there would be a big jump forward. It's an addition to LEED. So when people are talking about LEED and energy efficient buildings, the sites rating program actually builds the most resiliency into the landscape itself around what's being built. So that I mean, push your politicians to look at sites rating system and adopt it.
Awesome. So we will, it sounds like there's a bunch of resources, the paper that you mentioned, the sites link, we'll put those as we post this later. We'll put some resources in the chat to make sure people can find resources. Really interesting and important. And so I think we should wrap. We've covered a lot of time, a lot of ground, lots of good dialogue here and comments. Just thank you all for joining. I see so many new people and friends and familiar faces here in our feed. And so thanks for joining us. A shameless plug here. We are in our, as we're kind of in December, wrapping up and doing these fun site visits. We're also in the moment of doing our year-end giving appeal. So please take a moment to jump over to our website, www.ndc-md/donate, and think about doing some end-of-year giving for our cause. As you've heard, we're doing a lot of really amazing on-the-ground work. I relish the opportunity to sit down and talk with folks about that work that you're in and on the ground day-to-day doing. So please support, and we look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow as we visit the Perrin Mitchell House. It's going to be a really special visit, and you can do so from the warmth of your desk or sofa. Sounds like we'll be out in the icy weather tomorrow. So we'll see you again tomorrow.
Thank you.